Hopefully there we go. We're live. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today here as USITT continues our community conversations. I am David Stewart, known as D Stu in the industry, and my pronouns are he and him. I currently reside on the stolen land of the Seminole people, which is also known as Orlando, Florida. For those who may not be able to see me, I am a light-skinned black man with bald hair, or a bald head, I should say, a lack of hair, eyeglasses, two pierced ears, a full beard, a floral button-down shirt, and over my left shoulder is a print of Muhammad Ali standing over Sonny Liston. I am the chair of the USITT's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, and today we are pleased to continue this conversation around changing and ending the production processes of the 10 out of 12s. Today's discussion will be moderated by my friend Bryan Huneycutt, and now I turn things over to his very capable hands. Thanks, my friends. Have a great conversation.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, David, or D-Stu, as everybody knows him. My name's Bryan Huneycutt. I am also coming to you from the land of the Seminole. My pronouns are he, him. I am a white man wearing glasses with a salt and pepper beard and brown hair. Over my shoulder is a canvas painting of of Paris. So today, as David said, we will be talking about no more 10 of 12s. And first, I want to get started by introducing our panel. So I'm going to move to what is right beside me on the screen, and we're going to introduce Catherine Campbell next.
I knew I was going to be first. I knew it. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Campbell. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm calling in from the unceded land of the Dakota and Ojibwe people, which is known as St. Paul in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. If you cannot visually see me, I identify as a cisgender female. I am a light-skinned Arab woman. I am wearing a purple sweater because it's cold in Minnesota. I have a gold necklace that's written in Arabic in my name. I'm wearing black headphones. I have brown hair, and right over my left shoulder is a table that's brownish with a printer on top that needs to print out more paper. So yes, thank you for having me here.
Thanks, Catherine. We're gonna drop down to Brian Smallwood if you're following along on the screen.
Well, and dropping down is also important from sort of a context. Hi, I'm Brian Smallwood. I use he, him pronouns. I'm joining you from the land of the indigenous Siouan, Algonquin, and Haudenosaunee peoples, also known as Harrisonburg, Virginia. For those of you who may not see me so well, I am a white male with blue eyes, curly receding hair, somewhat dashing, and over my left corner, you'll see a bunch of calendars and paperwork around my office where I'm coming in from.
And last but certainly not least, welcome Ruth Watkins.
Hi, my name is Ruth. I use she, her pronouns. I'm zooming in from the Piscataway Nation, also known as Baltimore, Maryland. Our lands have also been cultivated and cared for by the Lumbee and Lenape people. If you cannot see me, I identify as a white passing biracial Chinese / white individual, cis woman. And I'm wearing a black shirt. I've got curly, kind of frizzy brown hair, and over my shoulder there is a print of the Big Five from South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today. And one of the greatest things about this conversation is having all of these people in the network with very broad experience in our industry. I've had the opportunity to work with everyone here in some capacity, whether it be through a USITT or through other working groups, or in the case of Ruth and I working together with the Disney Company for many years. My history with the Disney Company is about 25 years, and we've spent a lot of times on different programs there. One of the reasons I am moderating this is I'm also on the working group of the 10 of 12s, no more 10 of 12s, with Mr. Brian Smallwood as well. So as we talk about those things, one of the things we wanted to do is share some thoughts, share what no more 10 of 12s is all about and why this is important in our industry. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to jump right into all of these things. And so we're going to look at some of the main questions that we've had out there. So as we look at no more 10 of 12s, what we're really talking about is the extended hours in the industry. So I want to start with asking, and Ruth, I'm going to go directly to you for this and let you start with this. What do you feel? How do long long hours impact safety, whether that be physical safety, emotional safety, and wellness?
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with your question right there, just in terms of our definition of safety. That safety doesn't just encompass your physical safety, it's also your emotional and mental safety. And I think none of us would ever really question having a 12-hour dance rehearsal. Like, your body cannot physically do that. Like, even pro athletes can't do that. So when we really think about just that logic and like just trying to imagine physical safety, the impact, that the toll that takes on your body physically, why are we struggling to connect the line that is also going to then impact our mental and emotional safety? And that, I'm Brian Smallwood, I'm sure you have so many more studies that can speak to this, but I mean, it's well studied within other industries that long hours really lead to poor decision making. I mean, I think there's been sort of the running joke amongst the no 10 out of 12s movement, just talking about how, like, I mean, how many of us haven't come in on the second day out of a 10 out of 12 having to undo all of the bad decisions we made after 9 p.m. last night. And while it's said a little tongue in cheek, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and that fatigue is certainly going to be a factor in not really making the best decisions that you can, specifically when it comes to just your physical safety. And I'd love anybody else to chime in.
Yeah, Ruth, I want to celebrate and uplift what you just said. I mean, you're absolutely right. I found a study that talks about if you go 17 hours without sleep, your alertness level is the same as a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05%. And if you go for 24, then it's at 0.1%. Like that's don't drive, like your arrested levels, right? And that's just exhaustion. And you talked about those thresholds. I loved your comment about we don't expect sports athletes at their best to get there, right? And we also forget that, a 10 out of 12 for certain folks is also a 14 out of 16 because they're working those breaks in between or they're working around it, right? So I think you're right that, if we ask ourselves, hey, do you do your best when you're exhausted? We all go, no, but it's like we forget about it when we're scheduling. And I can't tell if it's because we're like trying to solve the problem when we get caught up in it or not. But yeah, even the emotional, like, burnout aspect of our industry, it's greatly affected by this. And the physical aspect is huge. I know that in the film world, there are a lot of concerns about long hours because people die driving home from the shoot, right? You alluded to other industries like firefighting and such. I mean, they're losing more people to cancer and the drive home than fires, right? So it's all right there. It's very real.
Yeah, and chiming in on the statement of all of the research, looking at the research that does take place, so much of that research is done in industries that are healthcare industries, life safety as far as pilots, transportation, over-the-road trucking, and so many of those industries look at the extended hours in that aspect. But as far as looking at our specific industry and understanding how decisions are made, there's very little to no research going on that is directly applicable. So much of the research that Brian is using and much of the research that we're using as we dig deeper is coming from so many other industries that have a complete different set of variables. And so with that in mind, I want to go to Catherine for this and ask the question of, when we think about those variables, we think about those impacts of decision making, and we understand and we know that we're going to be making some negative or not good decisions. What are some of those impacts that you see coming from that, of fatigue during those long days, beyond this quote safety impact, beyond the wellness? What are some other hazards and things you see from that?
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I think exactly what people kind of hit on the head is decreased productivity. But one thing we were talking about kind of earlier this week was, as someone who has run a marathon before, and that's not a brag, but is how much training you have to go to get into this process and how much time it takes to keep going. And when we're in these long extended hours, how do you get to that next mile? How do they ask if you need to design this whole new element? How do we keep pushing through that when you may not have a banana or a glass of water handed to you or someone cheering you on. You may have someone pushing you down saying, we just need to get through the next queue. We're behind. We're not on schedule. And as Brian just said, you're working beyond that hour division of 12 hours. You're there for 16 hours. And then if you have notes before the turnaround, how do you have that time? And our bodies are just so fragile that we keep pushing through. And when we come back, we will not be able to be at the same level that we were before. And we will not be able to run as fast. And we were talking about this previously about that people that are in these cycles for so long, whether designers or crew, this is a standard that they're sipping in the schedule the whole time. So as much as we get a break from being in tech every now and then because we go to another production of some sort, it sits on the fact that if a designer is going week to week to week to a tech, they are going 10 out of 12s back to back to back, which is just not a healthy behavior. And if you ask me if I want to run a marathon every week, I would say no. If you ask me if I want to run a 10K tomorrow, I'd probably say no as well. So I think we have to respect the bodies to take time to recharge and also reflect that when we come back in fuller form, we're just not going to have the same energy, or we're going to be more fatigued than we were to hold that standard that we used to have.
Absolutely, and I think you've raised such a certain point of we've just become accustomed to this, and it's something that we think of and we just take for granted. So much of the feedback when we begin these conversations and begin talking about breaking down that systemic issue with the long hours, some of the things that we hear back is, well, it's always been this way. That's how I get my overtime. That's how I do it. It's part of the gig. You have to pay your dues. So when we hear those things immediately, and I see you all shaking your heads, so I know you've heard these things. What are some of the statements back to that? What are some of your feelings and responses when you hear those arguments against attacking these issues and trying to look at things in a different way?
I mean, I'm happy to start because I get fired up about this stuff. I think, it implies a longevity and a constancy about the way that we do things that just isn't there, right? 10 out of 12s came about because there were no, but it wasn't the 50s that, or the 40s that came about. They put it into effect because there were no limits and everyone was literally going berserk. So it's not that they found a great answer and this is what we want to do. It was what they could negotiate to in the absence of any threshold, right? So when we're having this conversation, we're actually picking up a rich tradition of saying we are worth this. And in a nation that undervalues what we do as artists and in a passion-based industry where people are willing to give so much of themselves, it's no, we need to redouble the protections that we put into place so that we don't abuse ourselves, So that I'll go on for the whole time. So I'm going to pass it off.
I mean, it's also just what they've imposed is no 10 out of 12. That's the maximum for actors. That's the maximum. You shouldn't exceed that time. And then fortunately, for those of us who are not on the stage, it's often more than that allotted time. But just, I just keep thinking when we're on this topic of safety as tied to 10 out of 12s, I can't but help just relate it to physical safety. And when I was working in Shanghai, I was PSMing the pirate stunt show out there. And we had a moment where we would have pirates run through the audience and they had a fight behind the audience members. And, because people are unpredictable, sometimes people stepped out into the aisle, which caught people sprinting by them by surprise. So our stunt coordinators actually told them from the get-go, you should only be running at 80% speed. Do not do a full out sprint because that gives you control and the ability and that 20% space to be able to pivot. And this was a show we performed up to 15 performances a day. We did, we hit 10,000 shows in under 3 years. So I did have a fair amount of data to look at, but consistently the guys playing this role running through the audience, whenever they were able to pivot and adjust and safely avoid colliding with someone in the VOMs, it was because they were running at 80% speed. And whenever guys did roll an ankle or almost fall into somebody, it's because they were out of control. They were pushing themselves to that 100% limit. And I just think of like the parallels to me are just so striking and so clear that when we are pushing ourselves to the max and we are out of control and don't have that 20% space to pivot or adjust or deal with a surprise problem, because we all know tech runs perfectly smoothly all the time, right? We never get surprised by problems that we suddenly have to deal with. Like you lose that space and you set yourself up for failure. So yeah, I think physical safety, like we see so much on the physical end. Why aren't we applying it to our own work hours?
And Ruth, I think you raised a very good point there with looking at those injuries and looking at understanding the cause and effect relationship with those. And I mean, we could talk for hours just about your experience in Shanghai alone. Very lucky to be able to be on site with you on that and work on that project because of so many of the lessons we learned from it. And to that point, having someone who is tied into the venue, tied into the moment, and really looking at and caring for everybody in that space in a way that they can ask the questions of when this happened, what were the surrounding issues. We so quickly gloss over injuries, quickly gloss over metrics, quickly gloss over those things. The person's okay, let's move on. We don't look at what caused this, what took place here. And a lot of that reaction is based on the fact that we are feeling like we're running out of time, feeling like we are rushed, feeling like we are on this steam train that you cannot slow down, you cannot stop. And so I think that's an important thing to pull out of that. And also, while I'm here, we did have the question, and just for clarification, when we're talking about no more 10 out of 12s, the 10 out of 12s, the impetus for that conversation started with 10 out of 12s. We really want to open the door to conversation of scheduling practices and work practices within the industry, and make sure that we're looking at those things in the appropriate way. So to answer that question that did come up, we're specifically talking about 10 out of 12s at first, but using that as the bridge to talk about better, more equitable work practices in the industry. And as I say that, I'm going to bridge that into my next question for you all. As we sit here and as I look at the screen, although we have many different identities represented from a visual standpoint, we all present in a very similar way. So how do these things, how do these rules and how do those working rules and the way we schedule in the industry, how do those differently affect the BIPOC population, and how do those cause an unequitable system?
Well, I think the 10 out of 12s and the way we schedule in theater is built on the foundation of white supremacy, of perfection and sense of urgency, either or thinking. That whole written out, and that's how production management is even broken down, that we must follow these guidelines, and that is not the way we should function as an industry anymore. And when we have BIPOC community members coming into the space, we're holding them to that standard, and we're having them overwork to reach, the certain level that we're setting, which is not a healthy standard to have, especially in a high intense period during tech or even during a rehearsal process. And that's why we need to look at our schedules again and reflect upon that. I was sharing this with Ruth earlier this week, but as someone who is white passing and biracial, there are many incidents in my life that I've had to miss because I was in a theater situation and my work has come first, and I've had to put things on the line for family traditions and holdings because I had to get this job done. I had to be there for a few extra hours, and explaining that to my mother. So if you're watching this, I love you. But explaining that to my mother of why I was still at work and why I was still calling her, at 2 a.m. from New York when California is, she's asleep. She's like, what are you doing? This is not healthy. And I think that's why, as management and other individuals in this field, we need to make sure we have a more balanced schedule, because for BIPOC communities, your family is your support system. And without that, that's something that we lean on so readily. And so it's giving them more time and space, but also ensuring that we can not burn out and not have the ability to do the other things that are set in our schedule and standards.
I mean, there's also a certain amount of privilege that comes with being able to work those crazy long hours. I mean, a whole separate conversation just about the financial barriers into entry within our industry. But I mean, there's also been a lot of talk of how Unpaid internships are work as gatekeepers. And like, I've caught myself as well in situations where I'm like, oh, I can't take that internship because I don't have a family to front me and pay for me to be at, work an unpaid job in the summer. So that's exclusionary to folks who don't have the financial means. And when like historically, BIPOC individuals in America have been marginalized and don't benefit from the generational wealth that has often been accumulated by, white families. Specifically for myself, I do reap a lot of privilege that comes with being white passing, and I recognize that. But my mother is an immigrant to this country. My dad's white. My mother moved here from China, and I think along with pretty much any immigrant who chooses to leave their home country and move somewhere else, there is a hope for a better life. And same thing in terms of like her seeing that you're working these crazy long hours, but you're not getting a ton, like you're not getting that financial reward. What are you doing to yourself? Why did I move literally halfway across the planet to have a better life for my offspring? And she's not doing what I set out to do, like bad child. And so you kind of, I say that a little bit in jest, but those are concerns that I carry with me, and just like feeling just a little bit of that residual guilt, and a debt that I owe my mother for, packing up her life so many years ago and moving to this country. Catherine and I, we also can't speak for all BIPOC individuals within America, but I think those are some of the highlights.
I yield my time and thank Ruth and Catherine for their perspectives.
Yeah, and Brian, I think that's an important point. Speaking as the two white men sitting on the panel, I think it's important for us to understand the importance of yielding the time to those things and yielding the moment and make sure the voices that need to be presented are appropriately presented. And Ruth, one of the things that you expressed and D. Stu made sure that we have in our comments is how this does prevent the building of families. And so many people in our industry are making those career choices at a young age and at the time when people in other industries are planning families and looking at building a family, looking at adopting, looking at what their options may be. And this industry, with the way that it is currently structured, can prevent that. And I think at the time that we are in with COVID, also, our industry has been shut down for an extreme period of time. We can look at this as an opportunity that how do we reopen better, which is the timing that is wonderful about having these conversations, because we have a gap. We have an opportunity to think about how we're operating these things and how we come back. Another challenge is that we also have an exposure with people considering to come in this industry, as this is a higher risk industry from a career standpoint. So many of the communities that we want to reach out to, this becomes an even more privileged community if we don't look at how we fill those gaps immediately. So which is the importance of these conversations and having everyone join into these conversations right now. So I want to jump to, and I know we have a limited time here and we've got a ton of things that we want to talk about. So I apologize for jumping back and forth and jumping around, but as we talk about those limits, as we talk about those things, what are some of the signals from a leadership standpoint as we're taking care of other individuals? What are those signals to let you know that people maybe are getting close to those limits, have reached those limits, or are now working beyond that capacity?
My knee-jerk signals are tears and injuries and emotional outbursts, and then like lots of errors or haphazard work from people with a history of being really solid. The other thing, it's not a joke, drunken behavior, which gets a lot of people in trouble. Those are also like very quick signals. But it's also in conversations. I was talking to, this is one of my favorites. I was talking to a student of mine, and he said, I don't think I can stay in this industry. I think I'm burned out. And I said, well, you've been in the industry for 2 years, so I don't let's talk about what's going on and why you're burning out about it. And once they start talking, like, you can tease out what their schedules are like. One of the things about students is they've actually got 2 jobs at any given moment, if not 3, because they're also a student and they might be working a job elsewhere and they're working on your show, right? So just having a dialogue about whether or not people are sleeping and whether or not they are overwhelmed and overworked can be another big factor for me.
Yeah, I think something you hit on that's so important that we don't always talk about is the emotional capability and standpoint of individuals at a certain point. And I think that's a breaking point I've noticed in my technicians, designers, or people I've worked with, and even myself. You know, when you're hitting this moment and you can't publicly show this breakdown, you have to go somewhere else to have this moment and unfold, unless you have an ally or an accountability partner to hold this space with. And, you know, as a production manager, sometimes at late nights in the space, if we're there beyond the times we should be, that's when you're having some of the deep conversations about, can I continue in this industry? Like, we are still here and we still have this list of notes to get done before tomorrow. And I think it's a deeper dive, as you said, Brian. I think that's so fascinating with a student who, you know, 2 years into it, when I don't know if I can do this. I think it's a reality check. We all have every production or event that we do thinking, are we going to make it across that finish line? And do I have the capacity to stay or walk away? And there's something about the passion that lives there. And that's something else that I see when they hit that point or breaking point, is the passion's not there. The team mentality is not there. It's kind of focused on, you know, this is my life and there's no balance outside of this box that I'm in. And that's what our industry hasn't been giving, is that you basically live at your job. And so how do you get out of that so there's balance to come back and recharge? And so I hope we can still have some thorough, like, heart-to-hearts with people, because they're important to have human connection in our industry. But I hope we can get over the point of having to have those meltdowns and try to figure out when we as individuals aren't, you know, consultants or therapists, and need to have those heart-to-hearts to make it through. So yeah, emotional drive is huge.
I'm so glad you brought up the recovery aspect, because that very same student I sent home and they got sleep for 2 weeks. They're back in, they're in the industry doing great. So, you know, it's like it hadn't calcified into permanent burnout yet. So
I can tell you, I know this is a side note, but I go to bed a lot earlier during the pandemic, and I'm like, wow, we would still be at work right now. I am going to sleep. My puppy's asleep on the floor. I don't know if she can do a 10 out of 12. So sleep is very important, and your health, and eating things that are healthier than takeout. So,
Catherine, I'm so glad you mentioned the takeout thing, because we had talked a little bit about this, just in terms of, like, when you're in a 10 out of 12, like, I always catch myself, like, going into tech, I'm just like, I must meal prep. Okay, I must meal prep for the next, like, 3 days, so I'm ready. So I, you know, but now I have to, like, make sure that I have the time to do mass cooking in advance. I'm very fortunate that my parents live nearby, and usually before I go into tech, my mom stops by with having meal prepped a fair bit for me. But not everybody has that support system, you know, like that. I recognize that privilege, and that is something that keeps me going. But that's not necessarily something that, especially if you're a designer and you are traveling elsewhere to be in tech, you don't have that help. But, like, for, you know, Catherine, we were talking about just like, oh crap, we default to ordering what is typically unhealthy takeout food because we haven't had time to actually cook something nutritious for ourselves. And so for myself, I just sort of see, like, Brian, you offered such a great list of what those indicators are when people are reaching that point. But when self-care starts dropping off the list of things that people are doing, that for me is just one of those number one indicators. And we're in an industry that is so focused on humans and human connection. And what we really need to do, and I mean, those of us who have that positional power of being in management positions, it really is up to us to make sure that we are holding ourselves responsible for our people and managing our people. And that when we think of ourselves as responsible for their safety, it's also their emotional and mental safety. And I feel so lucky. My boss, Carrie Gillette, I will always be on her hype squad. Like, she will tell me, hey, you need to take a break, or, hey, I'm seeing you putting in long hours. I'm here to rein you back in. And it's just a really beautiful reciprocal relationship that we have, where she calls me out. She calls me out when I'm pushing myself too hard. And I am so, so, so deeply appreciative of having a boss who says, it's okay. The world isn't going to crumble tomorrow because you didn't send that email today. So yeah.
Can I, I love everything you just said. And I love everything you're saying today. One of the things that I really appreciate about it is that when we're talking about the 10 out of 12, it is a moment for management. If the decision about how you're going to build the schedule is in management's hands, it is exactly that moment, right? Like, it is your chance to decide whether or not people are going to have the opportunity to do things safely. And there was an article a colleague of mine, Jackie, sent me called "Only Your Boss Can Cure Your Burnout" from The Atlantic. And it sort of identifies, whenever we start talking about this, everyone starts looking at the individual saying, like, why don't you just take care of yourself? And it's like, well, that's part of it. Like, if you have downtime, like, that is part of it. But like, what about what you're asking? And like, what is it that you're demanding of those folks? So I want to shake your boss's hand. We'll just take it from there.
Yeah, if I may jump in real quickly, Brian with a Y, I apologize. We're just going to keep rolling with it. You're doing great. I think this is something we're all I'm guilty of, not speaking for the rest of the room, but of holding a standard as a boss or a manager that if you just keep going, that's how you think your colleagues and your peers think that they should function. And I've had almost every boss I've had has functioned like that. So that's what I thought I had to bring to the table. And so what we are reflecting, the behaviors we're upholding, are telling people that are a part of our teams that this is how you need to sustain your behavior and your energy. And so we need to reflect on ourselves how we change that behavior so we can allow others to see that there's a different standard we need to uphold. And as Ruth said, the world is not going to crumble if you don't send that email. And I have not learned that lesson at all. The world is still here and I sent the email.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very important. And when we look at what are the examples that we are setting those folks who are in leadership positions, we tend to look at our jobs, our relationships, our lives in such a way where we carry our emotional baggage from place to place with us. And we set it down sometimes in the home or space of someone that it's not theirs to carry. But we each need to recognize that we do have it, that we are carrying it, and that others are carrying theirs. I'm also a mental health first aid facilitator, and one of the great things about that class and those courses is having that conversation about recognizing the signs of someone who is experiencing trauma, someone whose behavior is outside of their parameters that we may be used to seeing them in, and not saying that means that there's an issue, but it is saying that we should pay attention to that. And then our self-care, recognizing when we're operating outside of those parameters. A good friend of mine talked about this, and Ruth, you mentioned this as well. In this world, we ask for emotion. We live on and we beg for emotion to be expressed. We place ourselves in very emotionally vulnerable spaces on a regular basis. And then we ask that you stop those things when the curtain comes down. We stop those things when somebody says cut. And then we leave that all someplace else. And so many of the things we see happening in the industry, whether it be the focus on mental health, the focus on intimacy coordination, the focus on all of those things, we're beginning to look a little better at ourselves as a whole human being and what it takes to be a whole human being, and how that affects how we're able to express ourselves in our jobs as well as in our lives, and how those things intermesh. So Ruth, I think that statement of emotion is very important to understand. That is one of the things that makes this industry unique, is that we're asking you to bring your emotions to work. So we need to understand what then comes along with them. And something else, and I believe Brian touched on this as well. We also had a question about this in the chat, and the folks in the chat, I think they read my notes, because they're doing a great job of providing some fantastic segues here. So we're talking about leadership. We're talking how leaders can behave, how they can give examples. And so when we are talking about those leaders, we have the group that says, well, it's always been done this way. We have to do it this way. It's too expensive. And one of the questions in the chat came from, if you're in a producing house and you have your own space and you control your schedule, that's one set of parameters that you have a lot more freedom to deal with. If you are renting space and you're having to take your schedule and fit into something else, that's a different set of parameters. So what are some of the tips, tricks, and thoughts that we deal with that it's too expensive to think of it differently? We have to operate in this space. And Ruth, I'm going to lean on you on this because I know that some of the examples are actually on the No More 10 out of 12's website that come from your space. So if you could maybe share some of those work practices that you've discovered.
By my workspace, do you mean where I currently work at Baltimore Center Stage? Yeah, so I mean, when we think about cost, it's, I think you need to consider the financial cost, but all human costs. What is the human toll that you're taking? Like, if you're pushing people to work long hours, are you ready to, pay out the injury costs that could potentially result? I feel very fortunate to be here at Baltimore Center Stage, where our leadership team has been very, very supportive of getting rid of 10 out of 12s. And we actually just finished filming our first show. It's now available online, so you can stream it and pay for it and, support the arts. Shameless plug. But we teched and filmed that show with no 10 out of 12s. We ended tech early. And so we did a 5-day rehearsal week as well for all of the actors. Everybody got 2 days off. I mean, I don't know about how the rest of y'all have your weekends, but when I hit the weekend, I have one day where I'm just like sleeping and recovering. And then the next day I do the things that I need to do to take care of myself as a human being, like, laundry and cleaning the litter box, things that I need to do in order to support my life. And so it does not take me a full day to clean a litter box, full disclosure. I see you laughing at me, Catherine. But I mean, you have various human things that support your emotional health and growth that you need to have time and space to do. And so I think it's an adage, but it's also true. The work is going to fill the time that you allot for it. So whether it's 10 out of 12s or whether we did 8 out of 10s, which were still long days, I'll be honest, but I will say, for me, going in and being in the room during that process, the difference between showing up at 11 a.m. versus 9 a.m. meant that I actually had time in the morning to make my lunch. I didn't have to meal prep days in advance in order to actually eat something, and also save myself money on that end. I recognize I'm deviating a little bit from the question from our audience members about producing houses. But the thing is, when you think about shorter hours, no, you're not going to use that time elsewhere. There is, the cost of the space rental, but what you get really is actually you get more planning time. You get well-rested individuals who are coming in the next day, making better decisions. What we found actually is in the past, when I've done a 10 out of 12, we get to the production meeting at the end of the day, and all anybody is thinking of is, can we just be done? I don't want to be here. I want to bounce so I can crash and get 6 hours of sleep before I have to be here again tomorrow. And the difference that I found this time around, even just an 8 out of 10, was our production meetings felt more fruitful in terms of actually having the time and the mental space to discuss and actually problem solve, as opposed to previously at the end of 10 out of 12, where you're just I just can't wait to get the hell out of here. So I hope that is some consolation to the question from our audience. Just think of it as you're buying yourself decision-making space. And when you have a better plan, you're going to be more efficient with your plan.
Yeah, I really value that. I feel like a lot of times we put our value on linear time, and it makes sense, right? Because that is our constantly diminishing resource the moment we start. So I can understand why that would be a focus. And I understand why we put a value on money, right? That is also a fixed resource that we need to deal with. But the harder resource to measure is the human element, because they're not the same. I am not the same person if I have gotten a 12-hour day for 3 days versus 8 hours, right? You're not going to get the same stuff from me. And I'm the same guy, the same DNA, the same background, right? So part of it, I think, is understanding like you're actually going to increase what you get. I loved your comment about the decision-making aspect of it, because like we're in a custom industry, right? Like we're not just like constantly rebuilding that one Lion King set over and over again, right? Like we're doing this custom solution to that one spot, which means at tech, when we are out of time, like we are as close to opening as we're going to get, right? There is no float left, like opening is coming. We're not going to push back. That's when we need people to be able to creatively solve problems that come up and not go, God, man, you know, I just don't care. Just make sure that it stays remotely there. Here's timeline, let's do it. And then all of a sudden it falls on somebody, right? Like the value of a good decision in that time is so much higher, right? So like, why would you lose that in favor of like tracking the butts in seats? Or like you like, and I don't mean butts in seats audience. I mean like the linear time of someone in the space. Like that is not a great measure of productivity in the same way, right? And I often think of it as just a scope factor, right? No one says, hey, listen, we need to blow out the back wall of the venue that we're renting to get more room to make the show bigger. Like we understand that constraint. So if we look at this as a human constraint and not something to push, we're going to get there. It's the same way that people don't say like, well, let's just have people not eat all day. We'll get those hours. And it's like, no, we understand that constraint. Let's maximize our productivity with it, right? Rather than paying people for subpar work because they can't be their best selves. Like in that case, we're actually losing money, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so valid. I was cracking up at your custom-made Lion King sets over and over again. If I can see all those, that would be great. But no, I think that's valid of the triage of labor, time, and money. We're always so focused on, you know, time and money, where during this pandemic, to be able to reflect and unfortunately have the shutdown, we need to take the time to think internally how we're taking care of our people more than what's hitting the books and how much time we're in the space. And I think as we're reviewing this, as well as we're going into a completely new phase of what theater will look like, we need to rebuild what schedules are. We need to rebuild how we approach shows, how we're planning them, how we're blocking things out. It's just not going to work in the same functionality anymore. And we need to look at the whole triage, putting humans first rather than dollars, which we've had backwards for so long.
I'll just say, so when I was in Shanghai, the Shanghai Disneyland Resort, as part of the opening, we opened also with the first ever Mandarin production of The Lion King. And while that is a Lion King set, guess what? Still had to be customized because the stage that was custom built, the custom built theater in Shanghai wasn't the exact same size as everything else. And then, you know, like, even though we are still using Julie Taymor's vision in terms of executing it, you still got to ship it to China. So are your puppets going to ship properly? Like, everything is going to be unique and customized. The other point I kind of wanted to make just is my experience working in China for 4 years. China actually does have pretty stringent labor laws. And one of the things that was a lovely challenge is that there, for certain groups of employees, actually there's a cap on the number of hours that you can work in a quarter. And it's that you can work 608 hours in a quarter. We pushed up against this real hard because opening a Disney park it's a lot of work. Like, people, before I went out, people told me this is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. And Disney always exceeds our expectations. And we opened in June, which was right when the quarter ended. So we were running up against that hour limit. And so I was actually spending a lot of time like looking at my technician hours, because they were not allowed to work more than 608 hours over a 13-week period. I have to check my numbers because I did a little bit of math on this, which is just 608 hours is 46.7 hours a week. That's how much overtime was legally allowed. And for all of those, the individuals in that employment group, if you work 40 hours a week over 13 weeks, it was 120 hours. But after 500 hours, you actually start qualifying for overtime pay. So, I mean, it was a little bit tricky because overtime was calculated over a quarter versus a week. But just sort of like, you know, looking at it from that perspective, that put a cap on how long they could be there. And employees were also not allowed to work more than 11 hours in a day. So that applied actually across the board to my actors and technicians. Even as we're opening, a Disney park in Shanghai, and we were, running up against linear time, running up against the clock, we legally were not allowed to exceed certain working hours. And guess what? The park still opened. And it's still open, actually. They opened May 11th of 2020, and they're still open and have guests coming in. COVID be damned.
And Ruth, another memory from that experience is we were often running up against the bus and train schedules on how many of those things would happen. And if you were still in the space after a certain time, you had to get a taxi and you had to find a way to get home. So your options became very limited in that. So another piece to keep in mind as we're doing these is how many of the individuals on our crew, on our staff, are dependent upon that transportation schedule as part of their life, as part of their budgeting, as part of their needs, and how are we looking at those things as well?
Well, and I'm sorry, Catherine, after you, please.
I also just jump in with No, we were both pointing. We were in sync. We were like, choo, choo, like we were, doing lightsabers or something. So power to you. I just almost lost my thought. Oh, okay. So no, I think transportation is such a key thing because we don't know how long people's commutes to work are. And growing up in California, traffic is atrocious. And, if you had more than a 1 hour commute or is designated 40 minutes and it takes 2 hours and then you arrive to work, you're already like drained. And then if you do a 10 out of 12, and you have to drive 2 hours back home, and then you got to be back again. It's just not healthy. And also in New York as well, when I worked there, for a few things, if we go over time, there's a certain point that the subways aren't running as frequently, and the amount of money that we have to put forward to send people home in a taxi or an Uber or something just starts adding up. So if we had a more concrete schedule. So I'm going to pass the lightsaber to you, Brian.
No, well, I mean, you hit squarely what I was going to say, which is, when people start talking about, oh, well, I want to earn the overtime, it's like, well, how much are you spending on that trip home now if you get a cab instead, right? And how much are you spending on takeout? We've already talked about how much are you spending on healthcare, like in terms of like everything that's happening to you with that exhaustion, right? So I just want to highlight that. Also, I do want to correct that lightsabers do not make a choo-choo sound.
Okay, I will admit that my boyfriend just made me watch the whole Star Wars series, so I'm new to this. I just finished the 9th one like a few weeks ago, so I will upgrade my sound, especially for the Disney folks that have been on this call. I apologize. I also didn't want to copyright the sound just so this didn't get shut down, so that was out of respect, actually.
I do thank D-Stu for making sure that we mention
it. So there is I will say, especially when you're around this many people that have worked in so many wonderful aspects of our world, I want to make sure that we definitely express we all love this industry. We only want this industry to continue. We want to continue to push the envelope with the offerings and with the things we are able to do. We want things to be larger. We want things to be more grand and include more people. And so these discussions are not about limiting those things. These discussions about how do we do those things? How do we make ourselves more effective, more efficient, while taking care of the whole person? And many of the statements and many of the things we're talking about, and I believe Catherine had made this, labor, time, and money triangle statement. My immediate thought is that, I'm a safety and health guy. I come from the safety and health world. So when you talk about triangles, I'm looking at the fire triangle. And, I think we're looking at that same concept. When you get all of those pieces together, the oxygen, the fuel, and the heat, things burn. So when we're looking at that same equation, Catherine, that you brought up, and the labor, time, and the money, the only thing we're missing is an igniting force in that before we're burning something. And so it's very important as we're looking at those things, what are we willing to burn? My favorite phrase on any of the meetings that I've ever sat in, when someone looks at me as the safety guy and go, can we do X? I always say, yeah, you give me enough money and enough time, we can do anything you would like. And so the limiting factors become the money and time, not the will, not the expertise, not those things. And in these conversations, many of those things are what we're talking about, is those limiting factors. And so much of what we look at, both from the financial standpoint of what it is costing the leadership, the executive teams, what the cost is to the individual, as far as looking at making the overtime, meal penalties come up, and it's like, well, if we work through this, I can get an extra hour I can get an extra hour of work if I buy pizza. So the purpose of meal penalty is not to give us an extra hour of time. It is to make sure that people stop and eat. So we're really not buying ourselves that. And what do you think about those things? And we've mentioned food many times. We've mentioned fueling the body. What do we think about those shortcuts of, if I feed everybody, I can keep working?
Well, I have to jump in because from an Arabic standpoint, we like to feed people. So it brings me joy to bring food to people. However, as soon as you said pizza, it's that cop out of like, if I just buy a bunch of pizzas, people will just keep going. And I'm not a fan of it. I mean, I'm a fan of making snack tables. I think it's great. I think it keeps people, supported, so they may not have to go somewhere. But yeah, no, we can't pay people out with food to keep going. It's not healthy, and pizza's not a healthy option, no matter if you have pineapple or whatever on it. Yeah, no, sorry. I like pizza, I promise. Someone else jump in with their thought.
I mean, the thing is though, Catherine, but like what you're talking about is like, you like to use food as your love language of, this is how I'm showing appreciation. You're not using it to exploit people into pushing them past their limits. And I think that that's crucial for us to recognize. And the thing is, like, you never want to take what is a nice gesture and then co-opt it into becoming the norm. Like, I was seeing some comments coming in from our viewers that were talking, like overtime should be paid when it's needed. But if overtime becomes the norm and becomes what you're depending on for your living wage, I mean, first off, we should all be able to have a living wage, but like that's not good. That should, tapping into overtime or pushing ourselves sometimes, that should be sometimes. And when it's the norm, that's just no longer healthy for anybody. And Deist is yelling at us that overtime is for emergent situations. What are we doing as planners? And I mean, Catherine and I are both production managers. Like, what are we doing on the planning end that everything becomes an emergent situation? That to me speaks to poor planning.
Well, and there's data in this book called Productivity Through Wellness for Live Entertainment and Theater Technicians, brought to you by this business roundtable study called Scheduled Overtime Effects on Construction Projects, again, being pulled from a different industry, said that 8 60-hour weeks are as effective or productive as 8 40-hour weeks, and 3 80-hour weeks are as productive as 3 40-hour weeks. So in terms of those losses, right? And so one of the things, your comment about like making it the norm, I encountered a company who said, listen, we can't really pay you a high hourly, but we'll guarantee you 20 hours of overtime every week. And so then it turns into a decent wage. So their default was 60 hours a week, right? And from what that study suggests, that means that their model is working efficiently, right? So I feel like that's a real, I love that comment about, this is emergent situations, right? Like not a business practice, right?
Yes, and someone just put in the comments, which I agree with, that, there should be a living base wage. We shouldn't be relying on overtime to actually survive. I mean, years ago, I was offered a position that was a ridiculous offer of a salary, and I legitimately asked, how much overtime is there? Because I will not be able to survive on this salary based on what you offered. And so also just having transparency of compensation up front and making sure that we have a healthy, balanced schedule, that we don't have to push past our limit to make a living wage. So we have to reflect what we're paying people and asking people to do, and not compensating with, extra pepperoni on the pizza. So
we've touched a little bit on just like the question of burnout, like kind of throughout, but there is also a cost associated with burnout and replacement. replacing people. That when you're dealing with turnover, whenever you have a new employee come in, they're going to have an onboarding period. I mean, it's a separate conversation about how our industry does onboarding and can do that better. But I mean, like, I just found, quite frankly, like, in my experience, at least at Disney with my team, it was going to take me at least 3 months before I was going to see like productivity from a new employee, because their first month is just all like, how do I turn the computer on? Like, where are things? Where are these files stored, et cetera, et cetera. And so you lose that time when you push people to the max and burning them out and then having to replace them. And that's what that also says, is that your mindset is that humans are expendable. And that is just, in an industry that, again, centers the human experience, that just feels so counterproductive.
Yeah, and I think we rush people into it, and we also get comfortable with working with the same people over and over again, so we don't feel like we have to have the need to onboard people, yet there's so many conversations that need to be had to have someone comfortable in the space and set up for success. And so, as we move forward, making sure that we're hiring people outside of our comfort chamber and setting them up for success, onboarding them, training them, taking that time, which then takes more time to focus on the individual rather than, expending dollars in other situations. And I really appreciate what you said, Ruth, because we expend people so much that they reach their limit, that they're about to crack and hit their limit, and you're trying to figure out, great, did we crack them enough that they're going to stay with us, or did we crack them too much that they're going to walk away? But if we crack them barely and they're holding on, then they're still comfortable, right? And honestly, like, we need to stay in a secure pattern and not reach our breaking point as we typically do on not every single production, but most productions.
Yeah, well, I feel like that sustainable point, one of the things about the 10 out of 12 is that, in a way, I feel like it assumes the project is the only thing. Because like, it happens towards the end, hopefully there's very few of them, and then it opens, and then everything stops, right? But the thing is that for so many people working on that project, it doesn't stop. They're on to the next one. There was the designer conversation about jumping to the next 10 out of 12 immediately. But even if you've got your own, team or crew, they're probably, if you're in a regional theater or a university or something, it's not like everything else stops and you get your recovery time in, right? Like, you're going to hit the gas and then no one's going to be able to recover. There's going to go, even going back to a normal pace, if that feels like a break, that's not a break. That's not a break, right? So I feel like we need to stop thinking about it from that project perspective and think about it in a bigger picture.
And Brian, to that point, I think another important thing with our industry is we do have that opening day finish line. We do have that, that moment. So we really need to understand how that makes us operate. We create our family for this thing that we are doing, and in many cases, when we close, and that network that we've had for however long we've worked on the project is gone. And so not only are we dealing with, trying to recover ourselves, trying to recover from the work practices and the schedule that we've been keeping, we are now also missing some of the relationships that we may have had, the support groups that we may have had, and also, in many cases, the employment that is now missing. If we're still trying to find the next thing or still looking for the next job, there's always a window. Even if you're fantastic at your job from freelance, there's always the window between this thing and that thing. And when I get close to the end of this thing, have I lined up that thing yet? And now my stress level of that next thing starts while I'm still carrying the load to the finish line on the one I'm on. So that model in our industry is a very prevalent model on how it affects our emotional up and downs.
And I also want to highlight stage managers, right? Like, they just finished a 10 out of 12. They're on that day schedule. Now they're gear shifting to a night schedule. Everyone else, it stopped maybe. But stage managers are now in charge of the safety of everybody, and they're exhausted and they're still going, right? So yeah, I mean, depending on which position, it's even more complex, right?
Yeah, and jumping into that, round of applause to stage managers and everyone in production as well, because we're all working beyond our limits. But I just want to say, as you were talking, Brian, about the finish line of opening, how many openings we have reached, and it's it doesn't even feel like we're opening because we're still running, and we don't even get to have that dialogue because we're transferring so quickly into opening to talk about what went well during tech and how to have that debrief of what actually happened, because by the time you're able to have that, your designer is leaving to a whole nother tech to take that on. So how do we reach opening and have those, open conversations and also like not feel exhausted and like honestly sometimes wanting to take a nap as the show's opening and not having that same thrill that sometimes we can have. So
and from a research perspective, we continue to make the same mistakes over and over because of not understanding what those mistakes were in that process and in those things. So I think, go ahead, Ruth.
Right. I was wondering if I could just make a point really quickly, just wanting to recognize the moment that we're in now, in that across our industry, most people are out of work, or we are not producing live theater, or we're doing things in a very different way. And that when we come back from COVID, or as many of us are starting to come back, it's different. There's gonna be an adjustment period. I mean, like, this sounds a little silly, but like I was in tech and realizing, oh my gosh, my feet hurt because I haven't had to wear shoes for a whole day since the pandemic, really. Like I've been sitting home barefoot in my sweatpants, like, but just that physical, that was my first sign of physical discomfort. And then of course, the reality of dealing with masks, like I'm really thankful that my friend Tiffany, oh, are we at time? Was that why Christine popped in? My friend Tiffany just texted me just that CDC and health experts have looked at the length of day because of COVID, and they support a maximum 10-hour day. And of course, it could be due to mask fatigue as well, but just the physical experience of wearing something strapped to your face, we've seen that with our medical experts at the start of COVID, where we're seeing nurses with bruises on their faces as a result of this. I mean, we're not at that extreme, but we're going to be dealing with something similar. And I apologize, I'm running over time.
No. I think that is a very valid, a very important point to raise on that many of the jobs and many of the roles that I'm doing right now as a theater consultant the conversations are, how do we reopen? How do we reopen safely? How do we reopen appropriately? And between the passion of opening and the passion of opening correctly, it's a perfect time to get into these conversations and look at the information that is out there. And I do want to thank everybody for being part of this panel today, and also direct you to nomore10out of12s.com. There's a lot of great information there. There's also a survey on the No More 10 out of 12 site. We are looking for people in the industry to share how they feel, to share what's working, and especially share what's working. We know many of the things that we have opportunities in, and we want to make sure that we're expressing with people how we get to the right answers and how we tell the people that are in charge of the purse strings, this is a more effective way. This is a more efficient way. This will actually add to your bottom line rather than detract from that bottom line. So, and I also want to welcome David Stewart back into our conversation as we close out here. Thank you to David for making this opportunity for No More 10 out of 12s and the working group and the website nomore10out of12s.com. And thank you especially to everyone for joining us for our conversation.
Thank you so much. What a great conversation. You took a really heavy topic and made it accessible. So thank you all for that. If only someone had a book about that. Wait, Brian, you want to put that up there again? Yes. Go out, buy the book, please. He might even sign it for you. So again, thank you to our panelists for an amazing conversation. We will be continuing these conversations. We are slated to have 2 more No More 10 out of 12 conversations next month in April. That's tomorrow, actually. And then we'll also be having our BIPOC-focused community conversations around costuming happening next month as well. So please tune in for that. Apparently my dog thinks that they need to tune in for that as well. So today's session was made possible through the membership dollars and the Tanisha Jefferson Fund for Inclusion. You can join or donate at usitt.org. So thank you all for joining us, and please take good care of yourselves. Stay safe out there. We'll see you all later.